He was a man who measured his life in the turning of soil and the mending of fences. His name was Kael, that there were few left who used it. The world had grown distant, a rumour of kings and wars carried on the wind, and he had long since stopped listening. His world was this valley, a shallow green bowl cupped between the stony knuckles of the Dragon's Tooth Mountains. Here, the only law was the seasons. The only tax was sweat. His days began before the sun, with the familiar ache in his lower back and the chill of the stone floor against the soles of his feet. He would light the fire in the hearth, the motions so ingrained they required no thought. Tinder, kindling, 2 logs of seasoned oak, the scrape of flint and steel, the patient blowing on a nascent ember until it bloomed into a fragile flame. This was his first small victory of the day, a quiet defiance against the dark and the cold. The farm was small, just enough for one man to work himself to exhaustion. A patch of hardy vegetables, a field of rye that fought the rocky soil for every inch, and a small barn that housed a single, sway-backed milking cow and a handful of chickens. The house was stone and timber, built by his grandfather, and it stood against the mountain winds with a stubbornness Kael understood. It was a lonely existence, but it was an ordered one. Every tool had its place, every task its time. He had inherited the silence of the place. His parents were buried under the lone birch tree at the edge of the rye field, taken by a winter fever a decade past. He had not been a boy, but not quite a man, and the grief had scoured him out, leaving behind this quiet, functional shell. He worked, he ate, he slept. He did not hope for much, because hope was a currency he could not afford. Hope led to disappointment, and disappointment was a distraction from the work. The work was all that mattered. This evening was like any other. Rain had been falling since noon, a steady, morose drizzle that turned the paths to black sludge and beaded on the waxy leaves of the cabbages. Kael had spent the afternoon in the barn, reinforcing a section of the roof where the winter snows had left their mark. The air was thick with the scent of wet pine, cold mud, and the sharp bite of wood smoke from his chimney. He finished his work as the light began to fail, the grey sky deepening to slate. After milking the cow and scattering feed for the chickens, he returned to the house. The stew he had left simmering on the hearth filled the single room with a savoury warmth. He ate standing, ladling it straight from the pot into a wooden bowl, his gaze fixed on the rain-streaked window. The world outside was awash of deepening shadows and the ceaseless whisper of the rain. It was a sound that usually brought him a sense of peace, the feeling of being secure and sheltered while the world outside dissolved. But not tonight. Tonight the rain carried something else, a tension, an unease that settled in his gut like a cold stone. He told himself it was the changing weather, the way the wind moaned in the eaves, but he had lived here his entire life. He knew the sounds of his valley. This was different. He had just finished cleaning his bowl when he heard it, a sound that did not belong. Not the cry of a night bird or the rustle of a foraging animal. It was the sharp crack of a heavy branch breaking under a weight it was not meant to bear. It came from the woods that bordered his northern fence line. He froze, every muscle tensed. His gaze snapped to the door, barred for the night with a thick beam of oak. He was not a warrior. The only weapon he owned was the wood axe by the hearth, and he was more practiced at splitting logs than skulls. Raiders sometimes came down from the mountains, desperate and cruel, but they hadn't been seen this far south in years. He moved silently to the window, peering through a section of glass he had wiped clean. The rain distorted everything, turning the familiar shapes of trees into hunched, menacing figures. For a long moment, there was nothing but the downpour. He was about to convince himself it had been a deer, clumsy in the dark, when a shape detached itself from the deeper shadows of the tree line. It was large, impossibly large. It moved with a lurching, wounded gait, one hand pressed to its side. Even through the gloom and the rain, he could see the telltale silhouette, the broad, powerful shoulders, the formidable build. An orc. His blood ran cold. Orcs kept to their own territories in the high peaks. Their clans were brutal and insular. A lone orc, wounded and this far into human lands, meant one of two things. They were in exile, or they were being hunted. Neither was good. Behind the first figure, two more emerged, smaller, but still powerfully built. They were supporting the first, half carrying their wounded leader. They staggered into the relative clearing of his fallow field, their movements heavy with exhaustion. The lead figure collapsed to its knees in the mud. Kael's first instinct, the one that had kept him alive this long, was to douse the lamp, to retreat into the back of his small house and pray they passed by. They were not his problem. His world was this farm, its fences the absolute border of his responsibilities. To invite that kind of trouble in was suicide. But then he saw one of the smaller orcs cup their hands, catching the rain as it fell from the drooping leaves of a sapling. The wounded leader drank from their hands, a desperate, gasping motion. They were dying of thirst in a world made of water. There was a raw desperation in the act that cut through his fear. It wasn't the gesture of a marauder or a monster. It was the gesture of a creature at the very end of its strength. He watched as the leader, a female by the lines of her armor and build, slumped forward, her head bowed. He could see the dark stain spreading on the leather and iron plates at her side, even in the poor light. She was bleeding out in his field. He stood there for a full minute, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. Every sensible part of him screamed to stay hidden. But the image of her drinking rainwater from a leaf, the image of her followers trying to shelter her from the downpour with their own bodies, it snagged on something inside him, something he thought had been buried with his parents under the birch tree. He made a decision, a stupid, reckless, uncharacteristic decision. He drew a deep breath, walked to the hearth, and took down the heavy bar from his door. The wood scraped against the stone, a sound that seemed deafeningly loud. He opened the door, letting the firelight spill out onto the wet ground. The three figures in the field froze, heads snapping up. He could see the glint of their tusks now, the feral suspicion in their eyes. Kael didn't move. He simply stood in the doorway, a silhouette against the warm light of his home, and waited. Let them make the next move. He had offered the light. The rest was up to them. The two flanking orcs drew crude, heavy blades, their stances shifting from weary to wary. They placed themselves in front of their leader, a living wall of defiance. The wounded female, however, lifted her head. He could see her face more clearly now. It was a mask of pain, grimed with mud and blood, but her eyes were sharp, intelligent, and burning with a fierce, indomitable pride. Even on her knees, she looked more like a queen than a beggar. She said something in a low, guttural tongue. The two guards hesitated, glancing from him to her. She repeated the command, her voice strained but carrying an undeniable authority. Reluctantly, they lowered their weapons, though their hands never strayed far from the hilts. Slowly, painfully, she pushed herself to her feet. She swayed, and for a moment Kael thought she would fall, but her companions were there instantly, supporting her weight. They began to move towards the house, each step a visible agony for their leader. Kael stepped back, giving them space. He felt a tremor in his hands and clenched them into fists to still them. What was he doing? What madness had possessed him? They were orcs. The old stories painted them as nothing more than brutal savages. They crossed the threshold into his home. The sheer size of them filled the small room, making the familiar space feel cramped and alien. They brought the storm in with them, the smell of wet leather, cold iron, and blood. The two guards lowered their chieftain onto the packed earth floor near the fire. She slumped against the stone of the hearth, her breathing shallow and ragged. One of the guards, a female with a jagged scar across her snout, glared at him, her hand resting on the pommel of her axe. Her eyes were chips of obsidian, full of menace. "Why?" she growled, the single word a rough-edged stone in the quiet room. It was the common tongue, spoken with a heavy accent but clear enough. Kael looked from the guard to the wounded leader. He didn't have an answer that would make sense, not to her, and barely to himself. He glanced at the water bucket by the door, then back at the memory of her drinking from a leaf. "You were thirsty," he said, his own voice sounding hollow. He walked over to the bucket, his movements slow and deliberate. He dipped a clean ladle in, filled it with fresh, cool well water, and walked towards them. The scarred guard tensed, a low growl rumbling in her chest. The other, younger, just watched him with wide, uncertain eyes. He stopped a few feet away and held out the ladle. He didn't look at the guards. He looked at their leader. She watched him, her gaze unwavering. He could see the debate happening in those dark eyes, suspicion warring with desperate need. He held his position, his arm steady, making no sudden moves. After a long, tense silence, she gave a short, sharp nod. The scarred guard stepped aside, her disapproval a palpable force in the room. Kael knelt. He brought the ladle to the chieftain's lips. She drank, her eyes never leaving his. He saw the flicker of surprise in them as she tasted the clean water, not the muddy rain she had been forced to endure. She drank it all, her throat working. When it was empty, she leaned her head back against the stone with a shuddering sigh. "More," she rasped. He refilled the ladle. This time, as he brought it to her, her hand snapped up and locked around his wrist. It wasn't a violent grab, but the strength in it was terrifying. It was a grip like a forged iron manacle, fast, brutal, even dying. She could kill him. He knew that with absolute certainty. Her thumb pressed against the pulse fluttering in his wrist. She was testing him, feeling for the tremor of fear, the jump of deceit. He forced himself to remain still, to meet her gaze without flinching. He let her feel his heartbeat, let her judge it. He had made his choice. There was no going back now. "There is no poison," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "It is only water." She held his wrist for another 10 seconds, a lifetime. Then, with a slow exhale, her grip loosened. She drank again, more slowly this time. When she was done, she sank back, her eyes closing for a moment. The immediate crisis of thirst had passed, but the greater one remained. The wound in her side was still weeping blood, staining her tunic and the floor beneath her. "That armor needs to come off," Kael said, speaking to all of them. "I can't treat the wound through iron and leather." The scarred guard, Zasha he would later learn she was called, bristled. "You will not touch her." "Then she will die," Kael stated simply, without malice. "She's bleeding onto my floor. That's a bad sign for anyone." He looked at the chieftain. "Your choice." The leader's eyes opened again. She looked down at her side, then back at him. She gave another curt order in her own language. Zasha argued, her voice a low, angry torrent of guttural sounds. The chieftain cut her off with a single, sharp word. The argument was over. With great difficulty, the two guards began to unbuckle the intricate straps of their leader's armor. It was a patchwork of boiled leather, crude iron plates, and thick animal hides, clearly designed for function over form. As they worked, Kael went to the large chest at the foot of his bed. He pulled out clean linen cloths, remnants of old shirts, and the small wooden box where he kept his meager medical supplies. A needle and gut thread, a pot of foul-smelling herbal salve for sealing wounds on livestock, and a flask of strong grain alcohol for cleaning. It was crude, but it was all he had. When he turned back, they had removed the chest plate and the thick leather tunic beneath. The wound was laid bare. It was a deep, vicious gash, long and straight, as if from a sword or the tusk of a great beast. It was dirty, and the flesh around it was already beginning to look inflamed. She had lost a great deal of blood. It was a miracle she was still conscious. He knelt beside her again, placing his supplies on the floor. "This will hurt," he said, holding up the flask of alcohol. She just grunted, her jaw tight. "I have known pain." He believed her. He soaked the cloth with the clear, sharp-smelling liquid. The two guards watched his every move, their bodies coiled like springs. He ignored them and focused on the task. "Hold her," he said. They each took one of their chieftain's shoulders, their grips firm. Kael took a steadying breath and pressed the alcohol-soaked cloth into the wound. The chieftain's body arched in a silent scream. Her hands clenched into fists, her knuckles white. A low, guttural sound escaped her clenched teeth, but she made no other cry. Her control was inhuman. He worked quickly, cleaning the gash as thoroughly as he could, flushing out the dirt and grime. The smell of alcohol and fresh blood filled the air. When he was done, she was pale and sweating, her breath coming in ragged pants. But she was alive, and the wound was clean. "Now the needle," he said, mostly to himself. He threaded the gut into the curved needle, his farmer's hands, usually clumsy with such delicate work, surprisingly steady. He had stitched up his own share of cuts from scythes and axes over the years. This was just larger. He looked at her. Her eyes were glazed with pain, but still focused on him. "Go ahead," she whispered, the words barely audible. He began to sew. Each stitch was a slow, deliberate motion, pulling the ragged edges of flesh together. He could feel her shudder with every pull of the thread, but she remained unnervingly still. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the endless drumming of the rain, and her harsh, controlled breathing. Her two followers watched, their initial hostility replaced by a grudging, focused silence. They were watching a man with no warrior skill, no status, meticulously saving their leader's life with a farmer's needle and a steady hand. It took a long time. When he tied off the final knot, his forehead was beaded with sweat. He smeared the thick, dark salve over the angry red line of stitches, a crude barrier against infection. Finally, he bandaged her side with the last of his clean linen. It was done. He sat back on his heels, the exhaustion hitting him all at once. The room was a mess. Blood and muddy water stained the floor. The orc's discarded, battered armor lay in a heap, and on his hearth a wounded orc chieftain was sleeping, or had at least passed into a state of pain-induced unconsciousness. The scarred guard, Zasha, looked from her leader's sleeping form to the crude but effective stitchwork, then to him. The open hostility in her eyes had been banked, replaced by something more complex. Suspicion, yes, but also a sliver of something else. Respect? No, that was too much to hope for. It was more like recalculation. She was re-evaluating the threat he posed, which was currently 0, and the utility he represented, which had just proven to be significant. "She is Graka," Zasha said, her voice low. It wasn't an introduction. It was a statement of fact, as if the name itself should mean something to him. Chieftain of the Blood Tusk clan. It meant nothing to him. He was a farmer. Clans and chieftains were stories from another world. "She needs to rest," Kael said, getting to his feet. He felt his knees crack. "And I need to clean my floor." He picked up a bucket and a rag, but the younger guard, Vaughn, stepped in front of him. She took the bucket from his hand, her movements hesitant. She looked at Zasha, who gave a nearly imperceptible nod. Vaughn began to clean the floor, her work clumsy but determined. Kael watched for a moment, surprised. He hadn't expected that. He looked at Zasha, who was now checking the bindings on Graka's bandages, her touch surprisingly gentle. He was too tired to argue or even process it. He gestured to the pot of stew still warming by the fire. "There's food, if you want it." Then he walked to his own narrow bed in the corner of the room, lay down fully clothed, and fell into a deep, uneasy sleep, the smell of blood and rain filling his dreams. The days that followed fell into a strange, new rhythm, a fragile truce held within the four walls of his small house. Kael went about his chores, though he moved with a new awareness, a constant thrum of tension under his skin. The presence of the orcs changed everything. The space felt smaller, the silence heavier. Greca remained by the fire, drifting in and out of a feverish sleep. Her recovery was a battle fought in grim silence. Zasha and Vorn never left her side. They were her shadows, her protectors. One was always awake, always watching. Their suspicion of him remained, a sharp edge to every interaction, but it was tempered by a grudging dependence. He was the one with the clean water, the warm hearth, the meagre but reliable food. He would leave a bowl of stew or broth by the hearth, and later he would find it empty. He would stack fresh firewood inside the door, and in the morning the fire would be lit before he woke. No words were exchanged about these things. They were transactions in a silent language of survival. On the third day, the fever broke. Kael knew because he woke in the pre-dawn chill to find the fire already roaring, a welcome blast of heat in the cold room. Greca was sitting up, her back straight, staring into the flames. Her colour was better, the grey pallor of near death replaced by the natural olive green of her skin. She was still weak, but the iron core of her was beginning to reassert itself. He got up and began his morning routine, moving around the small space with the quiet efficiency of long habit. He pulled on his boots, splashed water on his face from the basin. He was acutely aware of her eyes on him, tracking his every move. He went outside to milk the cow. The rain had stopped and the world was washed clean, glistening under a pale, watery sun. When he came back inside with the bucket of warm, frothing milk, he found Zasha attempting to sharpen her axe on his grindstone. She was struggling, her technique creating a rough, uneven edge. Kael stopped and watched her for a moment. He could have let her ruin the blade. It would have been one less effective weapon in his house. But the sight of a tool being misused grated on his craftsman's soul. "You're holding it at the wrong angle," he said, his voice startling in the quiet. Zasha stopped, glaring at him. "This is orc steel. A human knows nothing of it." "Steel is steel," Kael replied, setting the milk bucket down. "And that's a bad edge. It'll chip on the first real impact." He walked over. He didn't reach for the axe. He pointed at the stone. "You need to keep the blade flat. Follow the curve. Let the stone do the work." He picked up a piece of his own kindling and demonstrated the angle, the smooth, sweeping motion. Zasha watched him, her expression a mixture of scorn and curiosity. After a moment, she grunted and tried again, mimicking his motion. The sound of the steel on the stone changed, becoming a smoother, more consistent hiss. He left her to it and went to the hearth. He poured some of the fresh milk into a small pot to heat for Greca. As he worked, he felt her gaze on his back. When the milk was warm, he poured it into a cup and offered it to her. She took it from him, her fingers brushing his. Her skin was calloused and rough, but there was a warmth to it that surprised him. "The bleeding has stopped," she said. Her voice was stronger now, a low rasp that held the promise of its former power. "Good," he said. "The stitches will hold, but the wound needs time. Any hard movement could tear it open." "We do not have time," she stated flatly. "No one ever does," he replied, turning back to the fire. That afternoon, a quiet act of reciprocation occurred. Kael came in from the fields, his shoulders aching from turning the heavy, damp soil. He found a stack of firewood by the door, split and neatly piled. It was twice the amount he would normally cut in a day. Vaughan was sitting nearby, wiping resin from a large, brutal-looking axe that was not her own. She had clearly used Graka's weapon, a tool far too large for her to do the work. She wouldn't meet his eye, but the message was clear. We do not take without giving. That evening, as he sat mending a leather harness by the fire, Graka spoke. "You live alone," she said. It wasn't a question. "I do," he answered, not looking up from his work. "You have no mate? No kin?" He pulled a stitch tight, his movements precise. "They're buried under the birch tree." A silence fell between them, filled only by the crackling of the logs. He expected a platitude, or perhaps a dismissal of his human grief. Instead, she said, "Loss is a cold bed." He looked up at that, surprised by the simple, profound truth of it. She was staring into the fire, but her thoughts seemed far away, in a place of cold beds and colder losses. "My brother was meant to be chieftain," she said, her voice low and tight. "He was strong, respected. He spoke of uniting the fractured clans. A fool's dream." Kael waited, sensing there was more. "Urgok, our war leader, saw my brother's strength not as a gift to the clan, but as a threat to his own ambition. He challenged him to a ritual combat. But Urgok does not fight with honor. A poisoned blade is his preferred tool. My brother died slowly, his strength eaten away from the inside." She placed a hand unconsciously over her own bandaged wound. "Urgok declared himself chieftain. He said my brother was weak, that the poison only revealed the truth. Our laws are old. The strong rule. Few dared to question him." "But you did," Kael said softly. Her gaze snapped to his, fierce and hot. "I am my father's daughter. I challenged his claim. He would not grant me the ritual of combat. He named me outlaw, traitor, said I was unfit, that a female could not lead. He and his chosen warriors came for me in the night. Zasha and Vaughan. They are all that remain of my honor guard. We have been running for weeks." Now he understood. The desperation, the wounds, the flight. They were fugitives, hunted by their own kind, and he was harboring them. The cold stone of unease in his gut grew heavier. "Why tell me this?" he asked. "Because you did not ask for a price," she said, as if that explained everything. "And because my life is bound to your stitches, you have a right to know the trouble you are sewing yourself into." He returned his attention to the harness in his hands, the worn leather cool against his skin. He thought of his quiet life, the predictable rhythm of the seasons. It was gone. It had vanished the moment he unbarred his door. He felt a pang of loss for that simple, lonely peace. But as he looked at Graka, at the unyielding pride in her posture, even when she was broken, at the fierce loyalty of her two followers, he also felt something else. A flicker of purpose beyond the turning of the soil. One morning, he woke up and knew something was wrong. The air was too still. The usual chorus of birdsong from the woods was absent. He got out of bed and saw that Graccha and her retainers were already awake. They weren't relaxing by the fire. They were standing, armed, their bodies tense. "What is it?" he asked. Zasha pointed a thick finger toward the window. "There." Kael moved to look. At the edge of the woods, half hidden by the morning mist, he saw it. A symbol carved into the trunk of a large oak tree that marked the edge of his property. It was a jagged, stylized tusk, dripping with 3 drops of what looked like blood. "Urgok's mark," Graccha said, her voice a low growl. "His scats have fanned us." Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through him. They were here. The trouble he had harbored was now standing at his door. His farm, his sanctuary, was no longer safe. It was a target. "How many?" he asked, his voice tight. "This is a hunting party," Graccha said, her eyes scanning the tree line. "A small one. He sent them to test our strength, or to finish what he started if we were weak." She looked at him, her gaze practical and grim. "Your home has become a battlefield, farmer." "It's the only one I have," he replied. He looked around the small, cluttered room. It wasn't much, but it was his. The thought of it being defiled by violence, of these brutal orcs trampling through his grandfather's house, filled him with a cold, protective anger. "Their approach will be from the north," he said, his mind racing, shifting from farmer to tactician out of sheer necessity. "The woods give them cover, but the ground there, near the creek, it's marshy. Looks solid, but a heavy warrior in full armor will sink to his knees." Graccha's eyes narrowed, a spark of interest in them. "Show me." He took a charred stick from the hearth and drew a crude map on the floorboards. He marked the house, the barn, the creek, and the patch of deceptive swampland. "They'll see the barn as the easiest point of attack. It offers cover to get close to the house, but the path to it is narrow, between the fence and the swamp." "A bottleneck," Zasha grunted, a flicker of appreciation in her eyes. "We can't fight them in the open," Graccha said. "There will be at least 5, maybe more. Sasha, Vorn, you will take the barn. Use the hayloft for elevation. Do not engage until they are in the narrow path. Kael," she turned to him, "you will remain in the house. Bar the door. This is not your fight." "They are on my land," he said, his voice quiet but unyielding. "They carved their mark on my tree. It is my fight now." He looked at the axe by the hearth. He was no match for an orc warrior, he knew that. A single one of them could break him in half. But he would not hide in his own home while others fought for it. Graccha studied him for a long moment. She saw the fear in him, he knew, but she also saw the stubborn set of his jaw. She saw the man who had opened his door to his enemies, who had stitched her wound, who had just offered his knowledge of the land without hesitation. "The wound in my side is not fully healed," she said. "I cannot move as fast as I should. I will defend the house. Your knowledge of this place is a weapon. You will be my eyes. Tell me where they come from." It was a compromise, but it was one that acknowledged his role. He wasn't a warrior, but he wasn't useless. He nodded. "I will." The waiting was the worst part. The silence stretched, taut and brittle. Sasha and Vorn slipped out the back and disappeared toward the barn, moving with a predator's stealth that belied their size. Kael and Graka stood in the dim light of the house, the door now unbarred, a sliver of the outside world visible. They came an hour after dawn, 6 of them, huge, brutal-looking orcs clad in black iron and ragged furs, armed with heavy, cleaver-like swords. They moved with an arrogant confidence, spreading out as they approached the farm, their eyes scanning for threats. Just as Kael had predicted, they moved towards the cover of the barn. 6 of them, Kael whispered, his heart hammering. 4 moving on the barn, 2 circling east towards the house. I see them, Graka breathed beside him. She held a heavy, notched sword, her knuckles white around the grip. She was favouring her side, but her stance was solid as a rock. The 4 orcs reached the narrow path Kael had described. The leader, a massive brute with a helm fashioned from a wolf's skull, pointed towards the barn and barked an order. They started to move forward, their heavy boots sinking into the soft earth. That was when the attack came. An arrow, thick as a man's thumb, hissed from the hayloft and slammed into the throat of the rearmost orc. He gargled, clawing at his neck before crashing face first into the mud. Before the others could react, Sasha erupted from behind the water trough, her axe a whirlwind of steel. She buried it in the chest of the orc closest to her, roaring a challenge. The trap was sprung. The narrow path became a killing ground. The orcs, caught between the fence and the treacherous marsh, couldn't bring their numbers to bear. Vorn fired another arrow, catching a 3rd orc in the thigh, sending him screaming into the boggy ground where he began to sink. While the chaos erupted at the barn, the 2 remaining orcs broke from cover and charged the house. Mine, Graka growled. She moved to the doorway, meeting the first orc's charge not with brute force, but with a surprising deftness. She deflected his wild swing, the impact jarring her, a gasp of pain escaping her lips. But she used his momentum against him, stepping aside and slamming the pommel of her sword into the back of his knee. He buckled, and she brought her blade down in a swift, brutal arc that ended his attack permanently. The last orc, seeing his comrade fall, hesitated for a fatal second. Kael, standing just inside the house, acted on pure instinct. He grabbed the heavy iron poker from the hearth and hurled it with all his strength. It was a clumsy, desperate throw, but it struck the orc in the face. It didn't kill him, but it staggered him, breaking his charge. That was all the opening Graka needed. She lunged, her wound screaming in protest, and ran him through. He fell at her feet, his eyes wide with surprise. Silence descended, broken only by Graka's ragged breathing and the distant sound of Sasha finishing the last of the warriors at the barn. It was over. Kael stared at the 2 bodies sprawled in his doorway, the dark blood seeping into the dirt he tilled. The reality of what had just happened crashed down on him. He had helped kill 2 beings. He felt a wave of nausea. Graka leaned against the doorframe, her face pale with pain and exertion. She looked at the dead orcs, then at him. She saw the poker still lying in the mud. "Your aim is poor," she said, a faint, grim smile touching her lips. "But your timing is good." It was the highest compliment he had ever received. The aftermath of the skirmish left a permanent scar on the farm. They dragged the bodies into the woods, a grim task that soured the clean morning air. The ground by the barn was churned to mud and stained with blood. A sense of violation lingered. Kael's peace was not just broken, it was shattered. He knew this was only the beginning. That small victory had only confirmed their location. The real threat, Aragog, would come now. In the days that followed, the fragile truce in the house solidified into a working alliance. They were no longer host and guests. They were comrades in arms, bound by a shared thread. Kael taught Vorn how to properly fletch arrows, using goose feathers from his own flock. Zasha, in a grudging show of respect, showed him how to brace a door to withstand the battering ram. The quiet moments of domesticity became more frequent, more natural. He would find his axe sharpened to a razor's edge in the morning. She would find a cushion of folded sacks left by the hearth for her to sit on, easing the pressure on her healing wound. One evening, he was working on a piece of her battered armor, a shoulder plate that had been badly dented. He heated it in the forge he rarely used, hammering it back into shape with patient, practiced blows. She came to stand in the doorway of the small smithy, watching him. The firelight cast his face in shades of orange and red, highlighting the focus in his eyes, the sweat on his brow. He was not a warrior, but he had his own kind of strength, a quiet, enduring strength, like old iron. "You are a skilled smith," she observed. "My grandfather was," he replied, not stopping his work. "He taught me enough to mend things. Ploughs, hinges, armor is new to me." "You have a feel for the metal," she said. "You do not force it, you persuade it." He finished the piece, quenching it with a hiss in the water barrel. He inspected the work. It wasn't perfect, but the curve was true again. He handed it to her. She took the warm plate, her fingers tracing the smooth, repaired surface. "My clan's smith is a butcher. He beats the anger into his steel. It makes the blades brittle." She looked from the armor plate to him. "You have no anger in your work." "I'm too tired for anger," he said simply. "I just want things to be whole again." Her gaze softened for a moment, a flicker of something deep and vulnerable in her eyes. It was a look that saw past the farmer, past the human, and into the core of the man who had mended more than just her armor. The piece, such as it was shattered 2 weeks after the first attack. It was Vaughan who spotted them. Not a small scouting party this time, but a war band. At least 30 of them, moving through the high passes, their banners visible against the sky. At their head was a massive figure on a hulking, tusked beast. "Urgok," Graka said, her voice flat and cold as stone. She stood on the small rise behind the house, staring towards the mountains. "He comes himself." Kael stood beside her, his heart a leaden weight in his chest. 30. Against the 4 of them. His farm was about to be wiped from the face of the earth. Everything he had, everything he was, would be turned to ash. "We cannot win this fight," Zasha stated, her usual ferocity replaced by a grim realism. "We can run." "He will hunt us," Graka countered. "He will not stop. He cannot afford to have my claim to the chieftainship endure. He needs my head. She turned her gaze from the mountains to the small stone house below. This place, it is defensible, more than any cave or ruin in these woods. She looked at Kael. But it is your home. We have brought this doom upon you. We will leave if you say the word. This was his choice, his chance to reclaim his solitude, what was left of it. They could leave, and maybe Urgok would pass him by, a human farmer not worth the effort. He could rebuild the fences, the barn. He could find that quiet emptiness again. He looked at his hands, calloused and stained with soil and forge soot. He thought of the silence, the crushing loneliness he had mistaken for peace. He looked at Graka, at the proud line of her back, the weight of her people's betrayal heavy on her shoulders. He thought of her drinking rainwater from a leaf. No, he said. It was just one word, but it changed everything. It was the end of Kael the farmer, the man who endured. It was the beginning of something else. No? Graka asked, her brow furrowed. I am tired of things being taken from me, he said, his voice low but steady. My parents, my peace. This farm is all I have left. If he wants it, he will have to pay the same price I did, with blood and sweat. He met her eyes. I will not run from my own home. A flicker of disbelief, then a slow, spreading fire of respect lit Graka's eyes. Zasha and Vaughn stared at him as if seeing him for the first time, not as a fragile human, but as something else, something with a spine made of iron. Then we make our stand here, Graka declared, a new strength in her voice. We will make him bleed for every inch of this land. The hours before the attack were a blur of frantic preparation. They fortified the house, barricading the windows, leaving only small slits for arrows. They moved the cow and chickens into the woods, hoping they would be spared. Kael took them to all the weak points of his land, showing them the deadfalls he had prepared for predators, the narrow game trails that could be used for a retreat if the worst happened. As dusk began to settle, casting long, ominous shadows across the valley, the war band arrived. They did not attack immediately. They surrendered the farm, their campfires springing up like malevolent orange eyes in the gloom. The sound of their war drums began, a slow, deep, intimidating rhythm that vibrated through the very soil. Urgok himself rode forward, stopping just outside of arrow range. He was even larger than Kael had imagined, a mountain of muscle and menace. His armor was black and jagged, and he wore the wolf skull helm from the scout's description. Graka! His voice boomed across the field, a sound of gravel and arrogance. You hide in a human's hovel, behind a farmer's walls. This is the strength you would offer the Blood Tusk clan? Pathetic. Graka stood at a narrow slit in the wall, her face a mask of cold fury. Come out, little traitor, Urgok taunted. Face me, or will you die in there with your human pet? Kael, standing near her, felt a surge of hot anger at the word pet. He was not a pet. He was a man standing in his own home. It was then that Urgok revealed his cruelest stroke. From behind his mount, two of his warriors dragged a figure forward. It was another orc, old and stooped, his face etched with worry. Garuk, Vaughan whispered in horror from her position. The clan elder. Garuk has seen the wisdom of my leadership, Graka, Urgok shouted. He comes to tell you that your claim is dead. The clan has chosen. They choose strength. They choose me. He was not just here to kill her. He was here to destroy her legitimacy, to break her spirit before he broke her body. This was the moment of revelation Kael had unknowingly been waiting for. He knew she was a chieftain, but hearing it like this, seeing the political machinations laid bare, it cast everything in a new light. Her caution, her pride, her isolation. It wasn't just a personal struggle. It was the fall of a queen. And he, a simple farmer, had been her only court. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of inadequacy, a feeling of being a pawn in a game whose rules he could never comprehend. Had she been using him? Was his farm just a convenient hole to hide in? Was his kindness just a tool she had picked up? The trust he had begun to build felt like it was turning to sand in his hands. He felt a sting of betrayal, irrational as it was. She was a chieftain. He was just a farmer. They were worlds apart. Graka must have sensed his shift, the sudden coldness beside her. She glanced at him, her expression unreadable in the dim light. But there was no time for words. Urgok gave a signal. "Burn it!" he roared. The assault began. Orcs with torches charged forward, their goal not to take the house, but to incinerate it. The first volley of arrows from Vaughan and Zasha took down 2, but more came. A torch landed on the barn's roof. The dry timber, seasoned by years of sun and wind, caught instantly. Flames roared into the night sky. The world became a nightmare of fire, shouting, and the clang of steel. Kael ran from window to window, dousing small fires with buckets of water, his home turning into a smoke-filled hell. Graka and her retainers fought like cornered beasts, their arrows finding marks, their blades meeting any who dared to get too close. But they were too many. The main door groaned under the impact of a makeshift battering ram. The wood splintered. It wouldn't hold for long. The roof of the house was now on fire, smoke pouring into the room, choking them. They were being burned alive. "The back way!" Graka yelled over the din. "The trail Kael showed us! Go!" Zasha and Vaughan hesitated, unwilling to leave her. "That is an order!" she roared. Reluctantly, they obeyed, slipping out the small rear door and into the chaos, heading for the cover of the woods. The main door crashed inwards. Urgok himself stood there, framed by the inferno of the burning barn. He grinned, a predator savoring the kill. "Nowhere left to run, Graka." Kael stood near the hearth, the wood axe in his hands. It felt pitifully small. He was going to die here, defending a stranger's cause in the ruins of his life. Graka stood between him and Urgok. She was breathing heavily, her side clearly paining her, but her sword was steady. She was a chieftain to the last. But instead of attacking, she did something that stunned everyone. She looked past Urgok, her voice ringing out with all the power she could muster, a commander's decree that cut through the noise of the battle. "I am Graka, daughter of Boruk, rightful chieftain of the Blood-Tusk clan," she cried. Her voice reached her loyalists, who were fighting a losing battle outside, and it reached Urgok's warriors, who paused in their assault. "By the old laws, by the right of blood, I claim my place, and I claim my consort." Her gaze fell not on some mighty warrior, but on him, on Kael, the human farmer covered in soot, holding a wood axe. "I choose him," she declared, her voice echoing in the sudden, shocked silence. "I choose Kael of the Green Valley, he who showed strength when warriors showed weakness, he who showed honor when a chieftain showed deceit. He will stand beside me. His house will be my house, his people, my people." Urgok stared, his jaw slack with disbelief. Then he threw his head back and laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You choose a human, a soft, pink farmer. You disgrace your bloodline. You are truly insane." The declaration was a political masterstroke and a suicidal act of love all at once. In front of her enemy and what was left of her people, she had bound herself to an outsider, an ultimate act of defiance against the traditions Urgok claimed to champion. She was redefining strength, not as brute force, but as integrity, as kindness. Kael stared at her, the axe feeling heavy in his hands. His feeling of betrayal evaporated, replaced by a wave of stunning, humbling clarity. She wasn't using him. She was seeing him. In the midst of her own destruction, she had looked at him, a nobody, and elevated him before her entire world. She had seen his quiet work, his stubborn care, and named it worthy. "Kill them both," Urgok bellowed, his laughter turning to rage, "and burn this pathetic hovel to the ground." But his command was a moment too late. Her declaration had done its work. It had sowed a seed of doubt among Urgok's warriors, and it had given Zasha and Vaughn the opening they needed. They crashed into Urgok's flank from the darkness, fighting with the renewed ferocity of those defending not just a leader, but a cause they finally understood. The chaos gave Kael and Graka the chance they needed. "Now, Kael," she yelled, grabbing his arm. They plunged out of the burning house and into the night, the heat of the flames scorching their backs. They ran, not as a chieftain and a farmer, but as two people, their fates now irrevocably intertwined. They fled into the darkness, leaving the flames and the fighting behind, the sound of Kael's life burning down to embers, chasing them into the woods. The fighting at the farm bought them time. They ran until their lungs burned and the sounds of battle faded behind them, replaced by the quiet panting of their own exhaustion. They found Zasha and Vaughn at the prearranged meeting point, a small, hidden cave behind a waterfall that Kael had played in as a boy. The reunion was grim. They were alive, but they had lost everything. Kael's home was a pile of smouldering ash. Graka's warband was now just two loyal guards. They were fugitives with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the weapons in their hands. Kael sank to the damp cave floor, the reality of his loss washing over him. The house his grandfather built, the fields he had tilled his whole life, all gone. He felt a hollow ache in his chest, a grief so profound it was silent. Graka came and sat beside him, not too close, but near enough that he could feel her presence. The cave was dark and cold, a stark contrast to the warm hearth he had lost. "What you did back there," he said, his voice raspy from the smoke. "Naming me, your consort." "It was a truth," she said simply. "And a weapon." It showed them that my vision for the clan is not Urgok's. I do not value only brute strength. I value a foundation. You build things, Kael. You nurture them. Urgok only destroys. I chose the builder over the breaker. I'm a farmer, Graka, not a consort to a chieftain. The inadequacy returned, the feeling of being an imposter in her world. I offered you a place in my world, she said, her voice soft. Protection, a new home when I reclaim one. He looked at her then, at her proud, tired face, illuminated by the faint light filtering through the waterfall. He saw the sincerity in her eyes, but he also saw the trap. He would be her protected human, a curiosity, a symbol. He would not be a partner. I accept, he said, and he saw a flicker of relief in her eyes, but not as your consort, not as something to be protected. He got to his feet, forcing himself to stand tall, despite the ache in his bones and his heart. He looked down at her, the chieftain on the floor of a cave, and for the first time, he felt like her equal. If I am to be by your side, I will stand there, not behind you, not as a human pet or a symbol, but as Kael, the farmer who knows how to make the land feed you, the smith who can mend your steel, the man who holds the wall with you. He took a breath. If you want a partner, I am yours. If you want a dependent, then leave me here to grieve what I have lost. It was his declaration, his terms. Graka looked up at him, her expression unreadable. Zasha and Vaughn watched, holding their breath. This was a critical moment. A human, a lesser being by all their cultural standards, was dictating terms to a chieftain. A slow smile spread across Graka's face. It was not a grim, battle-worn smile, but something genuine and full of warmth. She saw the iron in his spine, the same unyielding core she had in herself. She pushed herself to her feet and stood before him. She was taller, broader, a warrior leader in her prime. But in that moment, they were the same height. Then stand, she said. It was a command, an invitation, and an acceptance, all in one. They left the valley the next day. Kael took one last look at the smoking ruins of his farm, a black scar on the green landscape. He felt the loss like a physical wound. But as he turned his back on it, he felt Graka's hand briefly touch his. It wasn't a gesture of pity, but of solidarity. He was no longer alone in his grief or his future. Their journey took them to a hidden camp in the high mountains, a settlement of orcs who had been cast out by Urgok's brutal regime, or who had fled his tyranny. It was a motley collection of about 50 souls, old warriors, young mothers, craftsmen and hunters. They were a clan in exile, starving and demoralized. Kael's arrival was met with open hostility and suspicion. He was a human, an enemy by birth, and the chieftain's strange new companion. The whispers followed him. The glares were constant. They saw him as a weakness, a sign of Graka's desperation. He did not try to win them over with words. He did it with his hands. He saw their pathetic attempts at agriculture, seeds thrown on frozen ground. He spent a week digging terraces into a south-facing slope, building retaining walls of stone, creating sheltered plots that would catch the sun and hold the thin soil. He showed them which wild mountain herbs were edible, which roots could be ground into flour. He saw their weapons, the chipped and brittle blades Graca had described. He built a small, efficient forge from clay and stone, with a bellows made from the hide of a mountain goat. He took their broken tools, their notched axes, and he reforged them. He didn't have the anger of their old smith. He had patience. He tempered the steel correctly, giving it a resilience it had never known. The warriors who had once sneered at him began to bring him their blades, not with demands, but with a new, quiet respect. He was not one of them, but his worth was undeniable. He was not a warrior, but he was making them all stronger. Zasha and Vorn became his staunchest defenders. Their initial suspicion transformed into a fierce, protective loyalty. He was repairing a shield for Zasha one evening, stitching a new leather facing onto the wood, when Graca approached. She had been busy from dawn till dusk, organizing defenses, training fighters, settling disputes, being the chieftain her people needed. "Tomorrow we send riders," she said, "to the other clans, to carry my story and to see who will stand with a chieftain who allies with builders." "It's a big risk," Kael said, not looking up from his work. "They might see you as weak." "They will see that our blades are sharper than they have been in a generation," she replied. "They will hear that our children are no longer eating bark. They will see strength, just a different kind." She watched him work for a moment, his hands moving with that same quiet competence she had first seen in his house. "I need to prepare," she said. "My father's armor. It needs to be made ready." Later that night, he went to her tent. The armor was laid out on a chest. It was old, beautifully crafted, but neglected. The leather was dry, the buckles tarnished. It was the armor of a king in exile. "It needs to fit me," she said. "The chest plate is too broad. The straps are worn." He picked up the breastplate. It was heavy, imbued with history. He began his work, not as a servant, but as a partner, preparing for their shared future. He adjusted the buckles, softened the leather with oil, and planned the alterations he would make at the forge in the morning. She stood before him as he worked, patient and still. He moved around her, checking the fit, his hands brushing against her. The air in the tent was thick with a different kind of tension now. Not the tension of survival, but the quiet, powerful pull of two people who had found their other half in the most unlikely of circumstances. He came to the final buckle at her side, near the place where his stitches had saved her life. The scar was a pale, silvery line against her skin, a permanent reminder of their beginning. His fingers fumbled with the strap. Her hand came up and covered his, stilling his movement. Her touch was warm and firm. "Kael," she said, her voice a low murmur. He looked up and met her eyes. In their dark depths, he saw no chieftain, no warrior, no fugitive. He just saw Graca. And he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that she was seeing him in the same way. Just Kael. This scene, in its quiet intimacy, was a perfect echo of their first real interaction. The wounded orc and the cautious farmer. But the fear was gone. The mistrust had vanished. All that remained was a profound, unshakable bond that had been forged in fire and loss, and tempered by 1,000 small acts of quiet care. He was no longer just a farmer, and she was no longer just a chieftain. They were two halves of a new whole, standing together on the edge of a new world they would build, or die trying. His home was gone, but he had found a new one, not a place of stone and timber, but a place beside her, and it was more than enough.